March 18th, 2024. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but Lenora Sutherland kept the mug balanced on the porch railing anyway, her fingers wrapped around ceramic that no longer offered warmth. 5:45 in the morning, and the sun hadn't crested the eastern tree line yet. Darkness still clung to the fields that stretched beyond the barn, 240 acres of Illinois dirt that her grandfather had broken with a team of mules in 1947. The land didn't care about debt or banks or foreclosure notices. It would still be here long after she was gone, indifferent to who held the deed. The papers sat on her lap, edges already softening from the number of times she'd unfolded them. First National Bank. Notice of intent to foreclose, March 31st. 13 days. She'd memorized the numbers without meaning to. $164,000 in debt, accumulated over 5 years of watching Graham die by inches. Cancer eating through his lungs, while medical bills ate through their savings. He'd never smoked a day in his life. 60 years old when the pneumonia finally took him in 2019, and she'd been a widow at 58. Sitting in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and endings. Graham's work jacket hung on the peg beside the front door. Still there after 5 years, because taking it down felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. She'd pulled it over her shoulders this morning out of habit, the canvas stiff with age and field dust, the sleeves too long for her arms. The fabric smelled like diesel and dried sweat and memory. Headlights swept across the driveway before she heard the engine. Too early for visitors. Too early for anything except bad news. Or worse news. Lenora set the coffee mug down and stood, her knees protesting the movement the way they always did now. Arthritis settling into joints that had spent 63 years doing hard work. The headlights became shapes, became 4 massive semi-trucks rolling up the gravel drive, flatbeds loaded with equipment still wrapped in protective sheeting. Green and yellow gleamed through the plastic in the pre-dawn gray. Her first thought was mistake. Her second thought was hallucination. The trucks kept coming, one after another, diesel engines rumbling low and steady. She walked down the porch steps, bare feet on weathered wood, then onto gravel that bit cold through her socks. The lead truck pulled to a stop near the barn, air brakes hissing. A man climbs down from the cab, mid-40s maybe, wearing a Heartland transport jacket and carrying a clipboard. Behind him, 3 more trucks idled in formation, exhaust rising white in the morning chill. The driver looked at his paperwork, then at the farmhouse, then at Lenora, standing there in her dead husband's jacket and yesterday's jeans. His expression was careful, professional. Mrs. Lenora Sutherland? The way he said it, like a question that already knew its answer. She managed a nod. Ma'am, I've got a delivery for you. 12 John Deere 6155R tractors. Need your signature confirming receipt. Where would you like us to unload? The world tilted sideways. 12 tractors. She heard the words, but they didn't connect to anything that made sense. There's been a mistake. The sentence came out thin, unconvincing even to her own ears. I didn't order any tractors. I'm about to lose this farm. I can't afford. The driver consulted his clipboard again, flipping through pages clipped under metal. No mistake, Mum. Order placed 3 weeks ago. Fully paid in advance. Cash transaction. We're just here for delivery and signature. He pulled an envelope from the clipboard, this one made of thick manila paper with her name written across it in handwriting she didn't recognize. Also have this for you. Instructions said to hand deliver it personally. Paid by who? She took the envelope with fingers that had started shaking. The driver shrugged, his face apologetic but firm. Don't have that information on my paperwork, ma'am. Says delivery to Lenora Sutherland. This address. Payment confirmed. That's all I know. But if you want my opinion, somebody out there thinks an awful lot of you. He paused, glancing back at the convoy. Ma'am, I've been doing deliveries for 23 years. Never seen anything like this. Now, where can we put these tractors? 12 brand new 6155 rupees. Lenora's mind did the math even as it rejected the calculation. $120,000 each, minimum. 1.4 million in equipment sitting on flatbeds in her driveway. And the envelope the driver mentioned had weight to it. Something substantial inside, beyond just paper. The South Field. The words came out automatic, farm logistics overriding shock. 40 acres. You can line them up there. The driver nodded, spoke into a radio clipped to his shoulder. Within minutes, the convoy moved with coordinated precision, backing into the empty field where she'd planned to plant corn if she could scrape together enough for seed. Hydraulics whined as the first tractor rolled off its flatbed, still wrapped in protective covering, pristine and impossible. The plastic caught the first rays of morning sun breaking over the tree line, and the green paint underneath gleamed like something from a dream she hadn't dared to have. Lenora walked back to the porch on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The envelope sat heavy in her hands. She sank onto the top step and opened it with slow, deliberate care. Inside were 2 items: a letter folded around a single sheet of expensive paper, and a bank document confirming wire transfer of $600,000 into her checking account 3 days ago. She stared at the numbers until they stopped looking like numbers and became abstract shapes that couldn't possibly be real. The letter was handwritten in black ink, the penmanship elegant and precise. Nora, 42 years ago, you saved my life. Not your father, not your husband. You. You saw me when I was invisible. You fought for me when everyone wanted me gone. You fed me when I was starving, not just for food, but for human decency. You told me, everyone deserves kindness, son. Not because they've earned it, but because they're human beings. I never forgot you, Nora. I never forgot your grace. These are yours. No strings, no obligations. Just gratitude from someone who never forgot the woman who saw him as worthy. CTM. She read it 3 times. The 3rd time, tears blurred the words until they swam together. 42 years ago. 1982. She'd been 21 years old, newly married, pregnant with Adelaide, though she hadn't known it yet. CTM. The initials circled in her mind, refusing to attach to any memory solid enough to hold. The delivery crew worked efficiently, tractors rolling off flatbeds one by one. The driver returned with paperwork, a thick stack of registration documents and operating manuals. She signed where he indicated, her signature shaky and illegible. He thanked her, wished her a good day, and the convoy pulled away down the gravel drive, leaving behind 12 John Deere tractors arranged in perfect rows, and a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Lenora sat on the porch steps until the sun cleared the trees and light spilled across the fields. The foreclosure papers lay beside her, suddenly meaningless. Everything had just changed. She just had no idea how, or why, or who had changed it. A car engine broke the stillness around 8:15. Adelaide's silver Honda Civic, the one with the dent in the rear bumper from where a student had backed into it in the high school parking lot. Her daughter visited every Sunday morning, had done so religiously since Graham died, bringing groceries and company, and gentle suggestions that Lenora sell the farm and move into town. Addie was practical that way, sensible in a way that came from teaching high school English for 15 years and learning to manage chaos with calm efficiency. The Honda pulled up beside the barn and stopped. Lenora watched her daughter's face through the windshield, watched confusion turn to shock as Addie registered the field full of tractors. The car door opened, Addie got out slowly, staring at the equipment like it might disappear if she looked away. "Mom." The word came out flat, stunned. "What is this? Whose tractors?" Lenora held up the letter without speaking. Addie climbed the porch steps, took the paper, read it while standing. Her daughter's face cycled through the same emotions Lenora had felt an hour ago: confusion, disbelief, wonder, and finally tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. "Someone gave you $2 million in tractors." Addie's voice cracked on the amount. "Plus 600,000 cash." "Mom, who?" "I don't know." Lenora pulled Graham's jacket tighter around her shoulders. "CTM, 42 years ago. I helped someone in 1982, but I can't remember who." Addie sank down beside her on the step, reading the letter again. "Mom, you've helped half the county over the years. How are you supposed to remember one person from 4 decades ago?" That was the truth of it. Lenora had spent her entire adult life feeding people who showed up hungry, hiring teenagers nobody else would hire, letting strangers sleep in the barn when they needed shelter. Graham used to tease her about it, said she'd adopt every stray in Illinois if he let her. After he died, she'd kept doing it, despite having barely enough money for herself, because stopping felt like giving up on something essential to who she was. There's more. Addie was on her feet now, pacing the porch. If they gave you this anonymously, they don't want recognition. But they must have been watching you. They knew about the foreclosure. The wire transfer was 3 days ago, right when the bank filed the public notice. Lenora looked at the tractors gleaming in the morning sun, then at the foreclosure papers still sitting on the porch railing. CTM had known she was about to lose everything, had known precisely when to intervene, had cared enough to give her not just enough to survive, but enough to thrive. "I need to find them." The words came out fierce, determined. "I need to know who this is so I can thank them." Addie disappeared into the house and returned 5 minutes later with 2 cardboard boxes from the hall closet, both labeled 1980s in Lenora's careful handwriting. "Your journals. You kept them every year from 1978 through 2005, remember? If you helped someone in 82, you probably wrote about it." They spread the boxes across the porch, pulling out spiral-bound notebooks with worn covers and pages yellowed at the edges. Lenora's younger self looked back at her from the careful cursive, entries documenting daily life on a farm that had always demanded more than it gave. She found 1982 in the second box, the notebook's cover decorated with a pressed flower that had faded to brown. July entries first. She flipped through pages describing heat and drought and her father's increasing frustration with low grain prices. Then, July 24th, an entry that made her breath catch. A boy showed up today asking for work. White, maybe 18, from Iowa. Said his name was Caleb Morrison. Thin as a rail, sunburned, terrified eyes. Dad took one look at him, and I saw his jaw tighten. Later, Dad pulled me aside. "That boy's queer, Nora, I can tell. We don't hire that kind." I told Dad we were hiring him anyway. Dad said no. I said if he didn't, I'd quit helping on the farm. Dad relented. "Caleb starts tomorrow, $35 a week, bunkhouse. Graham doesn't care one way or another, but I looked at that boy's eyes, and I saw someone who'd given up on humanity. I can't turn him away." Memory flooded back like water breaking through a dam. Caleb Morrison. Blonde hair, thin frame, hands that shook when she'd given him a sandwich. The way he'd looked at her like he couldn't quite believe she was real, like kindness was a foreign language he'd forgotten how to speak. Addie was reading over her shoulder. Caleb Morrison, CTM. Winston Blackwell had been a hard man, shaped by Depression-era scarcity and rigid ideas about how the world should work. Lenora could see him now, in memory, standing in the machine shed with his arms crossed and his face set in lines of disgust. "That boy's queer, Nora." The slur he'd used had been uglier than that, words Lenora refused to repeat even in her own mind. Winston had been dead since 2005, lung disease taking him at 72, and she'd mourned him while also acknowledging relief that his particular brand of judgment had left the world. The flashback came in fragments, pieces assembling themselves into something coherent. July 1982. She'd been in the barn mucking out stalls when the boy appeared in the doorway, backlit by afternoon sun. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice had been quiet, almost apologetic for existing. "I'm looking for work. Any kind of work. I can do anything." She'd straightened up, pitchfork in hand, taking in his appearance. Sunburned face, clothes that had been slept in for days, a backpack that looked like it had been dragged through hell. "When was the last time you ate?" The boy's face had flushed. "Yesterday morning, ma'am." Lenora had set down the pitchfork and walked him to the house. Graham was working his job in town, wouldn't be home until 5. Her father was out checking the north field. She'd made the boy sit at the kitchen table and fixed him lunch. Tomato soup from a can, grilled cheese sandwiches, 3 of them because he'd eaten the first 2 in under a minute. A slice of apple pie left over from Sunday dinner. He'd eaten like someone who didn't know when the next meal might come, careful and grateful, and trying not to cry. His name was Caleb Morrison, 18 years old, from Des Moines, Iowa. He'd been on the road for 7 weeks, hitchhiking south and east looking for farm work, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. His parents had kicked him out. He didn't say why, but Lenora had seen it in the way he held himself, the careful way he spoke, the terror in his eyes when he said the word parents, like it meant something that could destroy you. When Winston came back to the house that afternoon and saw Caleb sitting at the table, his face had gone tight. "Nora, can I speak to you outside?" The conversation in the yard had been brief and brutal. Winston had looked at Caleb through the kitchen window and pronounced judgment with the certainty of someone who'd never questioned his own assumptions. "That boy's queer, Nora. I can tell. We don't hire that kind here. People will talk. We can't afford it anyway." "Then we'll manage." Lenora had surprised herself with how firm her voice sounded. "We need help with harvest coming. He says he can work." Winston's jaw had set. "I said no. Then I quit." She'd looked her father in the eye. "You can run this farm yourself. I'll go stay with Graham's parents in town." The threat had landed. Winston needed her help more than he'd ever admit. His face had gone red, then pale. "Fine. But he sleeps in the bunkhouse, stays away from the house. And if there's any trouble, any talk, he's gone." Caleb had started work the next morning, $35 a week, and a cot in the bunkhouse that hadn't been used since the hired man left in '79. He'd worked harder than anyone Lenora had ever seen, up before dawn and working until dark, never complaining even when the July heat pushed over 100 degrees. Addie's voice pulled her back to the present. "Mom, are you remembering?" Lenora nodded, tears sliding down her face unchecked. "I told Dad if he didn't hire Caleb, I'd quit the farm." "I was 21 years old, and I'd never stood up to Dad like that in my life." There were more journal entries. August 7th. "Caleb's been here 2 weeks. Works harder than anyone I've seen. Barely eats. I noticed him crying in the barn yesterday. Asked what was wrong. He said his parents kicked him out for being an abomination. His father is a Baptist minister in Iowa. Told Caleb he was going to hell. Caleb hitchhiked here. Been sleeping rough for 6 weeks. He said he'd been ready to give up. I told him, 'You're not an abomination, Caleb. You're a child of God. same as anyone. He cried harder. I held him like he was my own boy. September 15th. Dad wanted to fire Caleb today. Said we can't afford him. I told Dad to cut my household allowance instead. Graham wasn't happy, but he didn't argue. I'm not letting that boy go back on the streets. He wouldn't survive out there. October 20th. Caleb left today. Got a factory job in St. Louis. Real wages, he said. When he hugged me goodbye, he whispered, "You saved my life, Mrs. Sutherland." I'd decided that night was my last. Then I met you. You're the only person who made me feel like I deserved to exist. I told him, "Everyone deserves kindness, son." He said, "I'll never forget you." I'll never forget him either. The entries stopped there. November's pages were full of harvest tallies and doctor's appointments and the slow realization that she was pregnant. December mentioned morning sickness. By January of '83, Caleb Morrison had become just another name in a lifetime of people she'd helped. Significant, but not singular. One thread in a tapestry of small kindnesses that had defined her days. Addie was searching something on her phone, fingers moving fast across the screen. "Mom." Her voice had gone strange. "Caleb Morrison. Iowa. Is this him?" She turned the phone around. The screen showed a Wikipedia page. Caleb Thaddeus Morrison, CEO of Morrison Agritech. The photo was a professional headshot. A distinguished man in his early 60s with silver blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. Net worth, $3.4 billion. Founded Morrison Agritech in 1991. Took the company public in 2018. Known for philanthropy focused on LGBTQ+ youth programs. Lenora stared at the photo, trying to see the terrified 18-year-old in this polished executive. The eyes were the same. Still that intensity, but without the fear. 3.4 billion. Addie scrolled through the article. "Mom, the kid you helped in '82 is worth $3.4 billion. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the air, burning off the morning chill. The 12 tractors sat in their perfect rows, monuments to gratitude 42 years in the making. Lenora stood up, her knees protesting again, and walked down the porch steps. She needed to move, needed the physical act of walking across her land to make this real. "We need to call the bank." Addie followed her. "You can pay off the foreclosure, sell 2 tractors, keep the rest, pay off your debt, and still have money left over." Thomas Werner answered his office phone on the 3rd ring. "First National Bank, Werner speaking." "Mr. Werner, this is Lenora Sutherland. I need to discuss my foreclosure." There was a pause, the kind that came from a banker who'd had this conversation too many times before. "Mrs. Sutherland, I understand this is difficult, but as I explained last week, the foreclosure date is set for March 31st. The process is already. I want to pay off the entire debt." Lenora kept her voice steady. "I need you to stop the foreclosure proceedings immediately." Silence on the line. Longer this time. "Miss Sutherland, your total debt, including fees and interest, is $164,000. Do you have access to those funds?" "I have 12 John Deere tractors sitting in my south field right now. Brand new, 6,155 rupees. I think I can manage to come up with 164,000. Werner's professional composure cracked audibly. "I'm sorry, did you say 12 tractors?" "Come see for yourself if you don't believe me. They're all sitting here, delivered this morning." Werner agreed to drive out that afternoon. Lenora spent the intervening hours reading more journal entries, piecing together the full picture of that summer in '82. Caleb learning to operate the cultivator, Caleb helping with equipment maintenance, Caleb sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings when Winston was in town at the feed store, talking with Lenora about books he'd read, dreams he'd had before his parents destroyed them. The Honda pulled out of the driveway around noon, Addie promising to come back in the evening. Lenora was alone again with the tractors and the memories, and the letter that had upended everything. Werner's BMW arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, the banker's punctuality as reliable as his conservative suits. He was mid-50s, gray at the temples, the kind of man who'd spent his career managing other people's money and developing the careful, neutral expression that came with that responsibility. He got out of his car slowly, staring at the field of tractors. Mrs. Sutherland. He walked toward her with the air of someone no longer certain of anything. I don't understand. Where did these come from? Lenora handed him the anonymous letter. Werner read it twice, adjusted his glasses, read it again. His face cycled through confusion, skepticism, and finally something like wonder. Someone anonymously gave you this equipment. It wasn't a question. Apparently. Werner walked along the rows of tractors, reaching out to touch one like he needed physical confirmation of its existence. Ma'am, each of these is worth approximately $120,000. This is an extraordinary gift. I just wish I knew who to thank. Lenora stood beside him, looking at the equipment that represented more money than she'd seen in 3 lifetimes of farming. The letter from Ashford and Chen Law arrived via certified mail the next morning, the return address showing a Chicago law office. Inside was professional letterhead and careful legal language explaining that the tractors had been purchased through an irrevocable trust, that the benefactor wished to remain anonymous per attorney-client privilege, and that if Mrs. Sutherland chose to sell any of the equipment, the proceeds were hers to keep, with no obligations or restrictions. The letter was signed by an attorney named Richard Ashford and included a direct phone line. Lenora called immediately. Ashford and Chen Law, how may I direct your call? Richard Ashford, please. This is Lenora Sutherland calling. A pause, then a click, then a male voice, professional and measured. Mrs. Sutherland, I've been expecting your call. How can I help you? Mr. Ashford, I received your letter about the tractors. I need to know who sent them. I'm bound by attorney-client privilege, Mrs. Sutherland. My client has specifically requested anonymity. Lenora kept her voice gentle but firm. Sir, someone gave me $2 million and I don't even know who to thank. You can't expect me to just accept that. Ashford was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his professional tone had softened slightly. Mrs. Sutherland, I can tell you this much. My client's instructions were very specific. They said you wouldn't remember them at first, but that when you did, you'd understand why this matters so much to them. They said you were the kindest person they'd ever met. The answer didn't satisfy her at all. It only made the mystery deeper, made the weight of unknown gratitude press heavier on her chest. She thanked Ashford and hung up, standing in her kitchen with morning light spilling through windows that looked out on fields her grandfather had broken with mules. That night she couldn't sleep. The journal entries from '82 lay spread across the kitchen table, 42-year-old words describing a boy she'd almost forgotten. Caleb Morrison. C.T.M. She pulled out her laptop, ancient and slow, and searched for Morrison Agritech. The company website loaded gradually. Agricultural robotics and artificial intelligence. Precision farming systems. Founded 1991 by Caleb Thaddeus Morrison. There were photos. Caleb at industry conferences, Caleb receiving awards, Caleb standing with other executives in front of gleaming corporate buildings. In every photo, he looked confident, successful. Nothing like the terrified teenager who'd shown up in her barn asking for work. She found his bio page, born 1964 in Des Moines, Iowa. Estranged from family at 18, worked his way through community college and Northwestern University. Computer science degree, 1988. Founded Morrison Agritech at 27. The bio didn't mention why his family had disowned him, but Lenora knew. Baptist minister father, fundamentalist mother, queer son in 1982 rural Iowa. The equation wrote itself in tragedy. The Morrison Foundation had its own website, $400 million in endowment. Programs supporting LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness. Scholarships for queer students pursuing STEM degrees. Emergency housing for teenagers rejected by their families. Every program description read like a direct response to the boy Caleb had been. The boy Lenora had fed and sheltered and protected when nobody else would. She clicked through photo galleries showing foundation events, young people receiving scholarships, ribbons being cut at new youth centers, Caleb shaking hands with governors and senators. In one photo, he stood beside another man, late 50s, their arms around each other's waists. The caption identified him as James Holbrook, architect. Married since 2015, the year the Supreme Court decision made it legal nationwide. Caleb had built a life. Not just survived, but thrived. Had taken the kindness she'd shown him and transformed it into something vast enough to help thousands of others. And now, 42 years later, he'd come back to help her. Lenora closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, Graham's jacket still around her shoulders, tears sliding down her face in the silence. The boy she'd fought her father to protect had become a man who fought for others. The teenager she'd fed when he was starving had created programs to feed hundreds more. The kid she'd told deserved kindness had built his entire philosophy on that single principle. Everyone deserves kindness, son. Not because they've earned it, but because they're human beings. She'd said those words to a crying 18-year-old in her barn, never imagining they'd echo across 4 decades and return to her wrapped in John Deere green and yellow. Never imagining that one moment of standing up to her father would compound into this. The foreclosure papers still sat on the porch railing, but they didn't matter anymore. In 13 days, instead of losing her farm, Lenora would walk into First National Bank and pay off every cent of debt. Would sell 2 tractors and keep 10. Would have money in the bank for the first time in 5 years. Would sleep without the weight of impending loss crushing her chest. But more than that, and this was the part that made her chest tight with something bigger than relief, she finally understood that the small kindnesses she'd spent her life giving away had mattered in ways she couldn't measure, to people she'd never see again, spreading outward in patterns she couldn't track. Caleb Morrison had been one person, one summer, one series of small acts. A sandwich, a job, a defense against her father's bigotry, a place to sleep, a reminder that he deserved to exist. And from that, somehow, everything else had grown. The memories came in waves over the next 3 days, each one sharper than the last. Lenora would be washing dishes or folding laundry, and suddenly she'd be back in the summer of '82, 21 years old, and stubborn in ways she'd forgotten she could be. The details emerged like photographs developing in solution. Caleb's hands shaking as he tried to thread a bolt through a cultivator bracket. The way he'd flinch when Winston walked past. The careful distance he kept from other people, like he'd learned that getting too close meant getting hurt. She remembered teaching him to rebuild a carburetor on a sweltering August afternoon, both of them sweating in the machine shed while cicadas screamed in the trees. His fingers had been quick, precise, better with small mechanical tasks than she'd expected. When the engine finally turned over, clean and smooth, he'd looked at her with something like disbelief. "I fixed it." The wonder in his voice had been childlike, as if he'd never been allowed to take pride in anything before. Graham had been working at the implement dealership in Marion that summer, coming home tired and uninterested in farm politics. When Lenora told him about the boy in the bunkhouse, her husband had shrugged. "Your father's farm, your call. Whatever keeps the peace." Graham had been a good man, but not a curious one, content to let Lenora manage the emotional architecture of their lives, while he focused on bringing home a paycheck. He'd met Caleb maybe half a dozen times that entire summer. Brief nods in passing, nothing that left an impression deep enough to remember. But Winston had been different. Her father had watched Caleb like a man watches something dangerous, waiting for it to prove his suspicions correct. Every morning, Winston would check the bunkhouse, making sure Caleb was awake and working by 6. Every evening, he'd inspect the day's tasks with silent scrutiny, looking for any excuse to confirm that hiring the boy had been a mistake. The tension had been constant, exhausting, a low-grade anxiety that permeated everything. Lenora pulled out more journal entries, reading passages she'd written in the privacy of late nights when Winston and Graham were both asleep. August 12th. Dad barely spoke to me at dinner. He's furious I'm protecting Caleb. Mom would have understood, I think. She always said kindness costs nothing. But she's been gone 8 years, and Dad's gotten harder without her to soften the edges. Her mother had died in 74, breast cancer taking her fast and brutal. Winston had never remarried, never even looked at another woman as far as Lenora knew. He'd just gotten quieter, more rigid, more certain that the world was going to hell and taking decent values with it. How a homosexual boy would have felt like surrender to everything Winston believed was wrong with modern America. September entries detailed the harvest crisis. Corn yields down 30% from drought. Soybean prices bottomed out. Winston sitting at the kitchen table, doing math that wouldn't work no matter how many times he recalculated. That was the night he'd told Lenora they couldn't afford to keep Caleb through October. She'd been washing dishes, hands in soapy water, when Winston made the announcement. "Boy's gotta go. Can't afford charity." The sponge had stilled in her grip. She remembered the weight of the moment, the knowledge that what she said next would matter. "Then take it out of my household budget. I'll manage." Winston's face had gone red, then white. "Nora, don't be stupid. You need that money for groceries, for I'll make it work." She'd kept her voice level, definite. Her hands were still in the dishwater, but she'd turned to look at her father directly. "That boy has nowhere to go, Dad. We send him away, he ends up dead in a ditch somewhere." The silence had stretched between them, taut as wire. Finally, Winston had stood up from the table, chair scraping harsh against the linoleum. "Fine. But when harvest is over, he goes. No arguments." Caleb had stayed through October. Lenora had cut $15 a week from her grocery budget, buying cheaper cuts of meat, skipping luxuries, making things stretch. She'd been pregnant by then, though she wouldn't know it until November, Adelaide growing inside her while she rationed food to keep a stranger fed. The email to Morrison Agritech took her 2 hours to write. She started it Wednesday evening, deleting and restarting a dozen times, trying to find words adequate for what she needed to say. The corporate website had a general contact form, impersonal and bureaucratic, but it was the only avenue she had. "Dear Mr. Morrison, if you are the Caleb Morrison who worked on my father's farm in the summer of 1982, I want you to know that I remember you now. I remember your courage and your kindness. I remember the boy who deserved so much better than what the world gave him. I don't know what to say about the tractors, except that you didn't owe me anything. You never did. But thank you doesn't seem like enough for what you've done. Please, if you're willing, I'd like to talk to you. Lenora Sutherland." She hit send before she could second-guess herself again. The confirmation message appeared. "Your inquiry has been received and will be reviewed by our staff. Please allow 3 to 5 business days for a response." 2 days passed with no reply. Lenora sold 3 of the 12 tractors through a dealer in Carbondale, the transaction handled with surprising efficiency once the dealer verified the equipment was legitimately hers. The money hit her account Friday morning, $364,000. She paid off the bank debt that afternoon, sitting in Thomas Werner's office while he processed the wire transfer and updated her account status from foreclosure proceedings to paid in full. Werner had looked at her across his desk with something like awe. "Mrs. Sutherland, in 30 years of banking, I've never seen anything quite like this." "Neither have I, Mr. Werner." She kept the remaining 9 tractors, more equipment than she needed, but somehow right to keep them. They sat in the south field like a monument to something she was still trying to understand. The package arrived Saturday morning via UPS, the driver requiring a signature for delivery. Plain cardboard box, no return address, postmarked from Chicago. Inside was bubble wrap protecting 2 items, a photograph and an envelope. The photograph was a Polaroid, the kind that developed instantly, colors slightly faded, but image still clear. Lenora stared at it, recognition hitting like a physical blow. There she was at 21, wearing denim overalls and a white t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her hand rested on her stomach, in the unconscious gesture women make early in pregnancy, though she wouldn't have known she was carrying Adelaide yet. Beside her stood Caleb Morrison, 18 and painfully thin, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that hung loose on his frame. They were standing next to the old John Deere in the machine shed, both of them smiling at whoever held the camera. Graham must have taken it, one of the rare afternoons he'd been home. Lenora's throat tightened. She looked so young in the photo, impossibly young, her face unlined and hopeful in ways she'd forgotten she'd ever been. And Caleb looked terrified, even while smiling, the kind of fear that lived in bones and couldn't be photographed away. The letter was handwritten on Morrison Agritech letterhead, the same elegant script from the anonymous note. "Dearest Nora, you're pregnant in this photo. I could see it even then. You had this glow that women get early on, though you didn't seem to know yet. Did you know by August? Your daughter Adelaide must be 41 now. Please tell her I said hello." That summer of 1982, I was 18 years old, and I'd given up on living. The world had made it clear I didn't belong in it, and I'd started to believe it. Not dramatically, not as a cry for help. I'd just accepted that some people weren't meant to survive. I'd been on the road for 9 weeks when I showed up at your farm, sleeping in ditches and abandoned buildings, going 3-4 days without food. I'd been beaten up twice, once in Iowa, once in Missouri, by men who could tell just by looking at me that I was something they hated. Every farm I stopped at before yours turned me away. Either they had no work, or they had work, but not for someone like me. The night before I met you, I'd slept under a highway overpass outside Marion. I'd decided that was my last night. I was going to walk into the woods the next day and not come back out. Then I saw your farm from the road. Something made me walk up that driveway one more time. And you were there. You saw me, Nora. When your father looked at me and saw something disgusting, you saw a human being who needed help. When he wanted me gone, you fought for me. You risked your relationship with your father, and I heard the fights, the nights you argued with him about keeping me, to protect someone you'd known for all of 5 minutes. You didn't just give me a job and a place to sleep. You gave me dignity. You taught me equipment repair and listened when I talked about books I'd read. You drove me into town when I was too afraid to go alone because I thought someone might recognize what I was and hurt me. You told me I wasn't an abomination when my own father had used that exact word. Everything I've built came from seeds you planted that summer. You taught me work ethic, that doing something right mattered more than doing it fast. You showed me integrity, that keeping your word even when it cost you something was the measure of character. You proved that kindness exists, that not everyone in the world wanted people like me dead. You made me believe I deserved to live.
Morrison Agritech exists because of you. My first product was farm management software, and I built it specifically thinking about you, struggling with those ledger books you hated. Every business decision I've made, I've asked myself, what would Nora do? Every time I've had the chance to help someone vulnerable, I've remembered that you helped me when I was the most vulnerable person I knew. The tractors and money are nothing compared to what you gave me, but they're what I can offer back. Please accept them. Please know that you saved my life in the most literal sense possible, and that everything good I've done in the 42 years since stems directly from your compassion. With eternal gratitude and love, Caleb Thaddeus Morrison. P.S. I'm in Illinois this weekend. I'd very much like to see you again, if you're willing. I'll understand if you'd rather not. Lenora read the letter 3 times, vision blurring with tears. The photograph lay on the kitchen table in front of her. 2 people frozen in time. A young woman who didn't yet know she was pregnant, and a young man who'd been hours away from ending his life. The moment captured between them looked ordinary, unremarkable. Just 2 people standing beside a tractor. But underneath that ordinariness was the weight of a life saved, a choice made, a kindness given that had somehow compounded across 4 decades into billions of dollars and thousands of lives helped. She picked up her phone with shaking hands and called Adelaide. When her daughter answered, Lenora's voice broke. He wrote back, "He's coming to see me." Adelaide arrived within the hour, leaving her own Saturday plans abandoned. They sat together at the kitchen table, passing the letter back and forth, studying the Polaroid like it contained secrets they could decode if they looked hard enough. "You were pregnant with me." Adelaide touched the photo gently, her finger hovering over Lenora's unconscious hand-on-stomach gesture. "Did you know?" "Not until November." Lenora wiped her eyes. "I thought I was just tired from harvest." "And you were fighting with Grandpa Winston to keep Caleb employed while you were pregnant and didn't even know it. Some choices aren't really choices." The question came out more plaintive than she intended. "They're just what decent people do when someone needs help. Most people didn't." Adelaide's voice was gentle but firm. "You said it yourself in the letter. Every farm before yours turned him away. You were the only one who said yes." The car pulled into the driveway Saturday afternoon around 2. A modest Subaru Outback in navy blue, nothing ostentatious or flashy. Lenora had been watching from the kitchen window since noon, unable to eat, running on nervous energy and emotion too large to contain. When the car door opened and the driver emerged, she recognized him instantly, despite 42 years of aging. Caleb Morrison was 60 now, his blonde hair gone silver, but still thick. He wore dark slacks and a light blue button-down shirt, casual but carefully chosen. A wooden cane rested in his right hand, and he leaned on it slightly as he looked toward the house. His face had filled out, lost the gaunt desperation of 18, but the eyes were the same. Intense blue, too observant, carrying weight. Lenora walked out onto the porch before she could talk herself into waiting. Her legs felt unsteady, her heart hammering against her ribs. They stood looking at each other across 20 feet of gravel driveway, 2 people separated by 4 decades and connected by a single summer. Mrs. Sutherland. His voice cracked on her name. The formality nearly broke her. Caleb. Just Caleb. He took 3 steps toward her, then stopped. The cane trembled in his grip. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "Come here." She didn't realize she was crying until the words came out wet. Caleb Morrison crossed the remaining distance and dropped to his knees on the gravel at the base of the porch steps. He reached up with both hands, cane falling aside, and gripped hers with a strength that belied his age. His face crumpled,
decades of restraint dissolving. "You saved my life." The words came out choked. "You saved my life, and I never got to thank you." Lenora sank down onto the step, pulled him close, held him while he sobbed against her shoulder.
He smelled like expensive cologne and old grief, his body shaking with the force of emotions too long held in check. She smoothed his silver hair with one hand, her own tears falling into it, murmuring wordless comfort the way she had in the barn 42 years ago when he'd broken down about his parents. "I'm sorry I stayed anonymous." He pulled back enough to look at her, his face blotchy and wet. "I didn't want you to feel obligated. I wanted you to have the help because you needed it, not because you felt like you owed me anything. Oh, honey, you don't owe me anything." She cupped his face in her hands. "You never did." "I owe you everything." His voice was fierce now, adamant. "Everything." Movement from the house made them both look up. Adelaide stood in the doorway, her own eyes red. Caleb pushed himself to his feet, retrieved his cane, turned to face her. "You must be Adelaide." The warmth in his voice was immediate, genuine. "I'm Caleb Morrison. I worked for your mother the summer before you were born." Adelaide came down the steps slowly. "I saw the letter. Thank you for what you did for my mom." "Your mother did infinitely more for me." Caleb extended his hand and Adelaide shook it, then pulled him into a hug that made him stiffen in surprise before relaxing into it. They moved to the porch, the three of them settling into chairs Lenora had put out earlier. The 9 remaining tractors sat in their rows in the south field, visible from where they sat. Physical proof that this wasn't a dream or a hallucination. "Tell me about your life." Lenora's voice was steadier now, though she kept the tissue clutched in one hand. "The letter mentions some, but I want to hear it from you. What happened after you left here?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, the cane propped against the armrest. "After I left the farm in October '82, I took that factory job in St. Louis. Assembly line work, brutal and mindless, but it paid $5.50 an hour, which felt like a fortune compared to what I'd been making. I worked double shifts whenever they'd let me, saved every penny I didn't absolutely need to spend." "How long did you stay there?" 6 months. Long enough to save $4,000. Then I enrolled at Gateway Community College in spring of '83. Computer science program. I'd always been good with math and logic, and computers were just starting to be accessible to regular people, not just universities and big corporations. His hands moved as he talked, fingers tracing patterns in the air, like he was typing on an invisible keyboard. I fell in love with programming immediately. There was something beautiful about it. You tell the computer exactly what to do, and it does it. No ambiguity, no judgment about who you are or who you love. Just pure logic. Adelaide leaned forward. "How did you afford school?" "Pell Grants, mostly. Plus I kept working nights at a printing press. Slept maybe 4 hours a night for 2 years. But I graduated top of my class, got a transfer scholarship to Northwestern, full ride, everything paid for." Lenora watched his face as he talked, saw the pride underneath the humility. "You must have worked incredibly hard. I didn't know how to do anything else. You taught me that." He met her eyes directly. "That summer in '82, I watched you work from before dawn until after dark. Never complaining. Just doing what needed doing. When things got hard at Northwestern, and they got very hard, I'd think about you, mucking out stalls in July heat, or fixing broken equipment in the rain. If you could do that, I could finish another programming assignment." The Northwestern years had been transformative. Caleb described studying computer science, while the field exploded around him, personal computers moving from hobbyist toys to business essentials. He graduated in '88 with honors and a dozen job offers from companies that needed programmers more than they cared who those programmers loved.
IBM offered me $60,000 a year. Microsoft offered 70. Those were staggering amounts to someone who'd been living on food stamps 2 years earlier. But you turned them down.
Adelaide had clearly read his biography carefully. I turned them down because I'd seen something they hadn't. Caleb's voice shifted, became more animated. Farmers were being told they needed to embrace technology. GPS guidance systems, yield monitors, variable rate application. But nobody was making software that actually worked for small family farmers. Everything was designed for massive corporate operations with IT departments. I thought about your ledger books, Nora. You sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil and a calculator, trying to track expenses and yields and figure out if you were making any money or just slowly going broke. I thought, what if there was software that made that easy? What if a farmer could just enter their numbers and the computer did all the math, generated all the reports, showed them exactly where they stood financially? So instead of taking a safe corporate job, you started a company with $4,000. Lenora shook her head in wonder.
Scariest decision of my life, but also the most important. Caleb's smile was self-deprecating. I called it Morrison Agritech because I wasn't creative enough to think of anything better. Rented a studio apartment in Evanston, bought a used computer, and started coding. The early years had been lean. His first product was FarmTrack, a simple program that helped farmers manage expenses and crop yields. He'd sold it for $99 per license, going to farm shows and ag conferences, demonstrating the software on a laptop while farmers looked at him with skepticism. By '95, he had 500 customers and $50,000 in revenue, barely enough to live on. But then, GPS technology became affordable. Precision agriculture stopped being science fiction and became reality. Farmers needed software to process all the data pouring in from their new equipment.
Morrison Agritech was positioned perfectly. By 2000, we had $3 million in revenue. By 2005, $15 million. By 2010, $60 million. Caleb recited the numbers matter-of-factly, like they were statistics about someone else's company. We went public in 2018. The initial valuation was $2.1 billion. Adelaide whistled softly. And now? Company's worth about $3.4 billion. My personal net worth is around $1.8 billion. Most of it still in Morrison stock. The numbers were too large to feel real. Lenora looked at the man sitting on her porch. Silver-haired, distinguished, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built something lasting, and tried to reconcile him with the terrified teenager who'd shown up asking for work. Every decision I made, I asked myself what you would do. Caleb's voice had gone soft again. When I had to choose between maximizing profit and treating employees fairly, I thought about how you treated me with fairness, even when it cost you money. When other companies were cutting corners on customer service, I remembered how you'd taken time to teach me things carefully, never rushing, making sure I understood. The Morrison Foundation came up organically. In 2008, Caleb met James Holbrook at a tech industry conference in San Francisco. James was an architect, also gay, also from a conservative religious background that had rejected him. They'd bonded over shared trauma, fallen in love over the course of a year, married as soon as the law allowed it. James wanted to do something meaningful with our money. Caleb's face softened when he talked about his husband. He'd worked with homeless youth in his 20s, seen too many queer kids thrown out by their families. We started the foundation in 2012 with a $100 million endowment. It's grown from there. What does the foundation do? Adelaide had pulled out her phone, was taking notes. Scholarships for LGBTQ students, especially in STEM fields where we're underrepresented. Emergency housing for queer youth experiencing homelessness. Mental health services,
because the suicide rate for queer teenagers is still horrifying.
Legal assistance for kids whose parents are trying to force them into conversion therapy. Every program sounded like it had been designed for 18-year-old Caleb Morrison, the boy who'd been kicked out and told he was an abomination. "How many young people have you helped?" Lenora asked. "Directly? About 17,000 over 12 years. Indirectly? Impossible to measure. Some of the kids we gave scholarships to are now doctors, engineers, teachers helping other queer kids." The patterns keep spreading. Just like what Lenora had started 42 years ago was still spreading outward, touching lives in directions she couldn't track. One act of kindness becoming thousands. The sun had climbed higher, warming the spring afternoon. Caleb shifted in his chair, his grip tightening on the cane. Lenora noticed it for the first time, really noticed it. Not just an affectation or precaution, but a necessity. The way he moved was careful, deliberate, like his body wasn't entirely cooperating with his intentions. "Caleb," she kept her voice gentle. "The cane, is everything all right?" His face changed, the animation draining out of it. "That's the other thing I need to tell you. Why I came now instead of waiting. Why the timing mattered so much." Adelaide straightened in her chair, tension suddenly radiating from her. "I have ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease." He said it calmly, like announcing the weather. "Diagnosed in December 23. Prognosis is 9 to 15 months from diagnosis. I'm 4 months in." The world seemed to stop. Birds still sang in the trees, wind still moved through new leaves, but Lenora couldn't hear any of it through the rushing in her ears. "No." The word came out broken. "Caleb, no." "I've made my peace with it." His voice stayed steady, but she could see the effort it took. "I'm 60 years old. I've had 42 years I wouldn't have had if you hadn't stopped me from walking into those woods. 42 years of living, loving, building something meaningful. That's 42 more years than I thought I'd get that night in July '82. "But you're only 60. Adelaide's voice was thick with tears. "That's not old. You should have decades left." "Should have, yes. But I'll take what I got." Caleb looked at Lenora directly. "You saved me when I was 18. You gave me a life I never imagined I could have. I got to fall in love. I got to marry the man I love. I got to build a company that employs 4,000 people and helps farmers like you. I got to create a foundation that's given 17,000 queer kids a chance at the life I had." Tears streamed down Lenora's face, unchecked. She reached across and took his hand, felt the slight tremor in his fingers that she understood now wasn't emotion, but disease. "Every good thing I've done traces back to you." His grip tightened on hers. "Every life the foundation has saved is your legacy as much as mine. You planted seeds, Nora. They grew into trees. Those trees made forests. And now those forests are seeding new growth everywhere. That's why I had to do this now. Why I couldn't wait any longer. I don't know how much functional time I have left. The disease is progressing. In a few months I might not be able to travel, might not be able to speak clearly, might not be able to do this." He gestured at the three of them sitting together. "I needed to thank you, face to face, while I still could." The finality of it was crushing. Lenora wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that medical science would find something, that he'd beat the odds, all the empty platitudes people offered when confronted with terminal illness. But she'd watched Graham die by inches, had learned that sometimes the kindest thing was accepting the truth rather than fighting it. "How long do you have?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Good months? Maybe 6. After that, progressive muscle weakness,
difficulty speaking, eventual respiratory failure. He said it without self-pity, just stating facts. James and I have made all the arrangements. Hospice care, medical directives, estate planning. It's all handled.
Adelaide stood abruptly, walked to the porch railing, stood with her back to them. Her shoulders shook.
I'm sorry to bring sadness when I came to thank you. Caleb's eyes followed Adelaide with concern. That wasn't my intention. Don't apologize. Lenora squeezed his hand hard. Don't you dare apologize for existing, for being here, for any of this. You hear me? He nodded, and for just a moment she saw the 18-year-old again, the boy who'd needed permission to believe he had value.
You're going to stay. It wasn't a question. You're not going back to some hotel. You'll stay here, with us, for as long as you want. Nora, I couldn't possibly. You absolutely could, and you will. Her voice had the same firmness it had carried 42 years ago when she'd told Winston that Caleb was staying no matter what. The bunkhouse is still there, or the guest room if you prefer. James is welcome too. Your family, Caleb. You've always been family. Caleb stayed. Not in the bunkhouse where he'd slept at 18, but in the guest bedroom with the wedding ring quilt Lenora's grandmother had stitched in the 1930s. James Holbrook arrived Tuesday evening in a rented SUV, tall and lean with graying temples and architect's hands that moved with precision when he shook Lenora's hand. The two men together had an ease that came from 16 years of partnership. Small gestures of intimacy so practiced they'd become invisible. James adjusting Caleb's collar, Caleb's hand finding James's shoulder for balance when standing. Wednesday morning, Caleb presented her with legal documents for something called the Morrison Sutherland Legacy Trust. $2.5 million in endowment, the papers said. Purpose stated as providing emergency assistance to family farmers in southern Illinois facing financial hardship. Trustees listed Lenora Sutherland, Adelaide Pierce, Barnaby Fletcher, plus 2 Morrison Agritech executives whose names Lenora didn't recognize. I want you to run this. Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table, morning light making his silver hair shine white. Help other farmers the way you helped me. Caleb, I'm just a farmer. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know everything that matters. His voice carried absolute certainty. You know what it means to see people when they're invisible. You know how to give help without making people feel small for needing it. Those aren't skills you learn in business school. Adelaide leaned against the kitchen counter, coffee mug in both hands. We could do emergency grants. Farmers facing foreclosure, medical debt, equipment failure. No lengthy applications, no bureaucracy. Just help when it's needed most. The Second Chance Fund. Lenora heard herself say it before she'd fully thought it through. Everyone deserves a second chance. Perfect. Caleb's smile reached his eyes. That's exactly what this is. The first 3 applications arrived within a week, word spreading through farm networks faster than any official announcement could have managed. Miriam Whitmore, from Lawrence County. 45 years old, widowed in 22 when her husband drove a tractor into an irrigation ditch and drowned. Left with 4 children and $92,000 in debt the bank wanted paid within 60 days. They drove to Lawrence County on Saturday, Lenora and Adelaide in the truck, Caleb and James following in the rental. Miriam's farm was smaller than Lenora remembered family operations being. 180 acres with outbuildings that needed paint, and fences held together with determination and baling wire. Miriam herself answered the door, looking exhausted, 45 going on 60, her hands rough from work, and her eyes carrying the specific weariness that came from single parenting while trying to farm full-time. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Lenora Sutherland. We spoke on the phone about your application. Miriam's face cycled through hope and fear so quickly they seemed like the same expression. Please, come in. The house was clean, but sparse.
Furniture that had been good quality once and was now just old. 4 children materialized from various rooms, 16, 13, 11, 8, all of them watching the visitors with the careful wariness children developed when adults usually brought bad news. Lenora didn't believe in drawing things out. "We're approving your application. Full debt payoff plus $15,000 for operating costs. The check will be in your account by Tuesday." Miriam's face went white, then red. She sat down hard in the nearest chair. "I don't understand. Why would you? I'm nobody. I can't pay you back. You don't pay us back." Lenora kept her voice gentle but firm. "When you're stable, when you're on your feet again, you help someone else. That's the only condition." The widow started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. The 16-year-old daughter moved to her mother's side, wrapped arms around her shoulders, glared at Lenora with fierce protectiveness until she understood these were relief tears, not grief ones. Caleb stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I was 18 when someone helped me. I had nothing and nowhere to go. That help saved my life. Your accepting this help means the kindness keeps moving forward. You're part of something bigger now." By May, Caleb's condition had progressed enough to be undeniable. The tremor in his hands had spread to his arms. His speech was starting to slur, words taking visible effort to form clearly. Walking required the cane always now, and some mornings required James's arm for support. But his mind stayed sharp, and he insisted on being part of every grant decision, reading applications with the same careful attention he'd given to business contracts. "Can I tell you something?" They were on the porch one morning, the May air warm and heavy with the smell of growing things. "About FarmTrack. My first product. Of course. I built it for you." His words came slower now, each one deliberate. "Do you remember showing me your ledger books? August '82. You were doing monthly accounting, cursing under your breath about how much you hated all the columns and calculations." Lenora's memory reached back, found it. The kitchen table covered in papers, her pregnant and not knowing it. Caleb watching her struggle with numbers that never seemed to add up right. "You said you wished there was an easier way, that computers were for NASA, not dirt farmers." "I remember. I was being dramatic." "You were being honest." Caleb's smile was crooked, half his face not quite responding right. "In '89, when I started coding FarmTrack, every feature I designed came from that conversation. The expense tracking, the yield calculations, the profit-loss reports. I built it thinking, this is for Mrs. Sutherland. This solves her exact problem. Your billion-dollar company started because I complained about bookkeeping? It started because you taught me to pay attention to real problems and solve them practically. That one conversation shaped my entire business philosophy." His hand found hers, the tremor constant now. "You never realized how much you influenced me. Every throwaway comment, every small lesson, they all mattered." The tears came easier these days, for both of them. Lenora squeezed his shaking hand and let herself cry, while the fields stretched green and infinite around them. The story leaked in September through channels Lenora never fully traced. A reporter from the Marion Gazette showed up asking questions about the legacy fund and the mysterious billionaire who'd given her tractors. Adelaide had mentioned something to a colleague, who'd mentioned it to someone else, and suddenly the local paper wanted an interview. Lenora said no 3 times before Caleb asked her to reconsider. "Please." His speech was badly slurred now, each word a struggle. "People need to know kindness still exists." She agreed to one interview, on her porch. No photos of Caleb. The story ran Sunday, front page. Local widow creates legacy fund after billionaire she saved returns to thank her. The article was straightforward, factual, hitting the key points without sensationalism. By Monday, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By Wednesday, NBC was calling. Lenora refused everything until CBS Sunday Morning made their pitch. Respectful, they promised. Focused on the human story, not exploitation.
The interview happened in October, conducted by a young correspondent who sat on the porch and asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than manufactured emotion.
Why did you help him when your father didn't want you to?
Lenora chose her words carefully.
Because he was a child who needed help. That was enough reason. But you fought with your father over it. You cut your own household budget to keep him employed. Some choices aren't really choices. She looked directly at the camera.
They're just what decent people do when someone needs help. The segment aired the last Sunday in October. 11 million people watching their breakfast while Lenora's face filled the screen. Her voice explaining that she'd just fed a hungry kid and Caleb had done everything else. The response was immediate and overwhelming. $5 million in donations flooded the legacy fund within a week. 1,400 applications from farmers across the Midwest. She hated the attention and endured it because Caleb asked her to.
He was in a wheelchair full-time now, his speech so impaired that James had to interpret most of what he said. But his eyes still tracked everything, still communicated more than his failing voice could manage. The letter arrived first week of November, hand-addressed to the Legacy Fund, with an Iowa return address. Adelaide opened it, read it twice, brought it to Lenora without speaking.
The handwriting was young, careful, the kind of penmanship that came from someone who'd been taught that presentation mattered.
Dear Mrs. Sutherland, my name is Natalie Morrison. I'm 24 years old, and I just graduated from Iowa State with a degree in sustainable agriculture. I'm also Caleb Morrison's niece, his older brother Stephen's daughter. I never met my uncle. My father disowned him in 1982 when Caleb came out as gay. Dad died in 2020, Mom in 2021.
I grew up hearing that Uncle Caleb was evil, that he'd chosen sin over family, that we should pray for his soul but never speak to him. But I saw your interview on CBS. I watched you talk about the scared 18-year-old you helped, and I realized Uncle Caleb wasn't evil. He was just a kid who needed help, and everyone except you turned him away. I'm not asking for money from your fund. I'm asking for a chance to meet my uncle before he dies. I want to tell him I'm sorry. That not all of us hated him. That some of us wish we'd known him. Can you help me? Natalie Morrison. Lenora called James immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the exhaustion of months serving as primary caregiver. Caleb has a niece. She wants to meet him. The silence stretched long enough that Lenora thought the call had dropped. Then, he didn't know Stephen had children. Stephen cut off all contact in '82. We assumed he'd died without reconciling. She wants to come for Thanksgiving if Caleb is willing. Another pause. Let me ask him. 20 minutes later, James called back. Caleb typed on his communication device. Yes, please. Tell her yes. Natalie Morrison arrived the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic with Iowa plates and a bike rack on the back. She was small and dark-haired, mid-20s, wearing jeans and an Iowa State sweatshirt. When she got out of the car and saw Caleb in his wheelchair on the porch, she stopped moving entirely. Uncle Caleb? He couldn't speak clearly anymore, but he raised one shaking hand in greeting. Natalie crossed the gravel slowly, then dropped to her knees beside the wheelchair. She looked nothing like Caleb, and everything like him. The same intensity in her eyes, the same careful way of holding herself, like the world might punish her for taking up space. "I'm so sorry." The words tumbled out fast. "I'm sorry my dad disowned you. I'm sorry I never knew you. I'm sorry for everything you went through." Caleb's hands moved to the communication tablet James held for him. The device spoke in a flat, computerized voice. "You're here now. That's what matters." Thanksgiving dinner was the strangest and most beautiful meal Lenora had ever hosted. 7 people around the table that had been built for 4. Herself, Adelaide, Adelaide's daughter Lily, who'd driven down from college, James, Caleb in his wheelchair, Natalie, and Barnaby Fletcher, who lived alone next door and had no family left. The food was traditional because Lenora didn't know how to do holidays any other way. Turkey and stuffing and mashed potatoes and 3 kinds of pie. Caleb couldn't eat solid food anymore. James fed him pureed turkey through a straw, while the rest of them tried not to stare, tried to maintain normal conversation. But there was nothing normal about this gathering. This collection of people who'd been strangers, or estranged, and were now something like family. Natalie talked about her plans for sustainable farming, organic methods that worked with soil health instead of depleting it. She wanted to create a farm that hired immigrants, paid fair wages, treated land and workers with equal respect. "I need a mentor, not money." She looked at Lenora. "I know the theory from school, but I don't know the reality of making a small farm work." "Stay here." Lenora made the offer before fully thinking through logistics. "Work with me through the winter. Learn what you need to learn." "Really?" Natalie's face transformed. "You'd do that?" Caleb's tablet spoke. "Please, I want to see you farm before I go." The disease accelerated through December. Caleb moved into hospice care, but Lenora refused to let him go to a facility. He would die in her house, in the guest room with the wedding ring quilt, surrounded by people who loved him. James set up a hospital bed and monitoring equipment. A hospice nurse came daily. Lenora and James split overnight shifts, one of them always awake and watching. The conversations happened late at night, when pain medication made Caleb more lucid than he'd been in weeks. The tablet allowed him to type what his voice could no longer manage. "Thank you for 42 years." The mechanical voice couldn't convey emotion, but Lenora heard it anyway in the care with which he selected each word. "Thank you for coming back to me. Promise you'll keep helping people." "I promise, honey." Adelaide brought Lily by every evening. Natalie had moved into the bunkhouse and spent her days learning farm equipment maintenance, her nights sitting with Caleb and James. December 22nd arrived cold and clear, temperature dropping below freezing overnight. Lenora woke at 3:17 to James standing in her doorway. "It's time." They gathered in the guest room, 5 of them. Lenora, James, Adelaide, Natalie, and Lily. Caleb's breathing had changed. The hospice nurse had warned them this morning. Hours now, not days. His eyes were closed, but he was conscious. His hand in James's on one side, Lenora's on the other. "We're all here, honey." Lenora kept her voice soft. "Everyone who loves you." His fingers tightened fractionally on hers. James was crying silently, tears running down his face unchecked. 16 years, Cal. I wanted 50 more. Adelaide stepped closer. "Thank you for what you did for my mom, for all of us." Natalie's voice shook. "I wish I'd known you sooner, Uncle Caleb. But I'll farm with the kindness you taught Aunt Nora. I promise." Lily, 19 and crying openly, leaned down to whisper something near his ear. The words were too quiet for Lenora to hear, but Caleb's lips curved into something almost like a smile. His breathing slowed over the next hour, each breath coming further apart.
Lenora held his hand and remembered 18-year-old Caleb standing in her barn, terrified and starving and clinging to life by threads so thin they'd been invisible. She'd given him work and food and the simple recognition that he deserved to exist. From that, somehow, everything else had grown. The final breath came at 4:33, gentle as falling asleep. James bent over him, pressed his forehead to Caleb's, stayed there while his body shook with grief. Lenora stood on the other side of the bed, still holding Caleb's hand, feeling the warmth leave it by degrees. He was 60 years old. He'd lived 42 years longer than he would have without her. But it still wasn't enough. Would never be enough. The memorial service in Chicago drew 2,000 people to a convention center. Tech industry executives, LGBTQ activists, farmers from across the Midwest, Morrison Agritech employees, past and present. James had asked Lenora to deliver the eulogy. She'd said no 3 times before he made it a personal plea. You knew him in ways nobody else did. You knew him before the success, before the confidence. Please. She stood at the podium in a simple black dress Adelaide had helped her pick out, looking at a sea of faces she didn't know, and spoke the only truth she knew. Caleb Morrison was 18 years old when I met him. He was scared, starving, and certain he had no future. His own parents had thrown him away like he was garbage. Every farm before mine had turned him away. I gave him a job and some kindness. He turned that into a life that helped thousands of people. The room was completely silent, 2,000 people holding their breath. He taught me that every small act of compassion can change the world, that you never know whose life you're saving when you choose kindness over indifference, that the measure of a good life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. He was my son in every way that mattered, and I will miss him every day for the rest of my life. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. The work continued. Caleb's will left the company to an employee ownership trust, his personal wealth split between James, Natalie, LGBTQ advocacy organizations, and the Legacy Fund. $600 million arrived in the fund's account in February, transforming it from substantial to genuinely transformative. The board hired Adelaide as executive director, her teaching career abandoned in favor of managing grants that now numbered in the hundreds. By March 2026, 1 year after the tractors had arrived, the fund had helped 312 farm families, $11.2 million distributed. Ripple effects traced through community networks. Miriam Whitmore hired a homeless veteran as a farmhand. The McKennas started mentoring young farmers. Howard Pemberton donated 10 acres for a community garden. The patterns Caleb had talked about were real, measurable, growing. In May, Lenora received the Presidential Citizens Medal in a brief White House ceremony. She accepted it wearing the same black dress from the memorial service, gave a 30-second speech that made the president smile, and donated the medal to the Morrison Agritech Employee Museum the following week. What mattered more was the lecture she gave at Southern Illinois University that same month. 700 agriculture students packed the auditorium, young people who would shape the future of farming. A sophomore in the 3rd row asked the question Lenora had been waiting for. How do you decide who deserves help? Lenora didn't hesitate. Everyone deserves help. That's not a question you get to ask. The only question is, can you help? If the answer is yes, you help. Period. But what if they made bad choices? What if they got themselves into trouble? Caleb was kicked out by his parents for being gay. He didn't choose that. But even if he had made bad choices, even if he'd gotten himself into trouble through his own actions, he still would have deserved kindness. We help because we're human, and humans deserve dignity. The lecture hall erupted in applause. After the lecture, walking across campus toward the parking lot, a young woman approached.
Early 20s, thin and nervous, wearing clothes that had been slept in.
Mrs. Sutherland? I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Emmeline. I'm homeless. I heard your lecture. I want to study agriculture, but I don't have anywhere to live. I can't afford tuition. I don't know how to... Come on. Lenora's voice was gentle. Let's get you some lunch, then we'll figure out the rest. The girl's face transformed. Really? Really?
They walked together toward town, Lenora already mentally cataloging what Emmeline would need. Stable housing, financial aid applications, possibly a job on the farm to provide income and practical experience. The same calculation she'd made for Caleb 44 years ago, for hundreds of people since. The math of kindness, simple and infinite. The 9 tractors still sat in the south field, Lenora having decided to keep them all as reminder and monument. Natalie used 3 of them for the organic operation she was building. 240 acres gradually transitioning to sustainable methods. The other 6 Lenora rented to neighboring farmers at below-market rates, the income going directly to the legacy fund. On clear evenings, Lenora would walk out to the field and stand among the equipment, touching the green and yellow paint, remembering the morning they'd arrived. 2 years ago now. 2 years since her life had been saved by someone she'd saved 42 years before that. She thought about Caleb often, imagined conversations with him about the people they were helping, the families being saved from foreclosure, the young people being given chances they didn't think existed. In her imagination, he was always both ages at once. The terrified boy standing in her barn asking for work, and the 60-year-old man who'd knelt on her gravel driveway and sobbed his gratitude. The Foundation's latest report sat on her kitchen table. 1,456 farm families helped since the fund's inception. 4,200 documented kindness acts traced back to fund recipients. Numbers that translated to lives, to futures, to possibilities that wouldn't have existed without Caleb's vision and Lenora's willingness to fight her father for a stranger. Adelaide brought the final numbers in March 2028. Natalie had expanded the organic operation to include immigrant farm workers paid fair wages, teaching farming classes for LGBTQ youth, building the exact kind of operation Caleb would have loved. She was 27 now, confident in ways she hadn't been at 24, teaching instead of learning, passing forward the knowledge Lenora had given her. The Polaroid from 1982 sat framed on Lenora's mantel. 21-year-old Nora, with her hand unconsciously on her pregnant belly. 18-year-old Caleb, with terror still visible behind his smile. 2 people who'd been strangers that morning, bound together by kindness, into something that had outlasted both their lives as individuals and become something larger. Something that would keep spreading long after Lenora herself was gone. She picked up the photo some evenings, traced the outline of Caleb's young face, whispered to him like he could still hear. "Look what you built, honey. Look at all these lives you saved." But the truth was deeper than that. He'd saved lives because she'd saved his. She'd saved his because someone had taught her that kindness mattered more than prejudice. That person had learned it from someone else, who'd learned it from someone before that. An unbroken chain of compassion stretching back through generations. Nobody saved anyone alone. Everyone who helped was themselves helped. The chain had no beginning and no end. Just an infinite cycle of people choosing to see each other as human. Choosing kindness when indifference was easier. Choosing to help
because someone had once helped them.
Lenora set the photo back on the mantel and walked out onto the porch. The same porch where she'd read the foreclosure notice, where Caleb had knelt, crying, where they'd sat together in his final months, talking about legacy and seeds and forests. The fields stretched green and eternal under evening light. Somewhere, a young person was being helped, being given a chance, being told they mattered. Somewhere else, that same young person would someday help someone else, continuing the pattern. The harvest of kindness, she thought, was infinite and eternal. You planted seeds without knowing what would grow. You gave without expecting return. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, the giving never stopped multiplying.